Hello everyone. I am Pooja Patle, Assistant Professor Tulsiramji Gaikwad Patil, College of Engineering, Nagpur. In today's session, we'll see about the static testing and the dynamic testing in unit testing. In software testing and quality assurance subject, unit testing is a concept in which static testing and dynamic testing are types of unit testing. Now, what is mean by static testing and what is mean by dynamic testing? We'll see the difference between them. So, static unit testing. In static unit testing, a programmer does not execute the unit. It does not execute the unit. Instead, the code is examined over all possible behaviors that might arise during runtime. Static unit testing is also known as non-execution based unit testing. Just because a programmer does not execute the unit. Whereas dynamic unit testing is execution based. In static unit testing, the code of each unit is validated against requirements of the unit by reviewing the code. During the review process, potential issues are identified and resolved. For example, in a C programming language, the two program halting instructions are abort and exit. While the two are closely related, they have different effects as explained below. So, what is the effect of abort and what is the effect of exit? So, in abort, this means abnormal program termination. By default, a call to abort results in a runtime diagnostic and program self destruction. The program destruction may or may not flush and close opened files or remove temporary files depending on the implementation. Exit. This means graceful program termination, that is, the exit call closes the open file and then returns a status code to the execution environment. Whether to use abort or exit depends on the context that can be easily detected and resolved during static unit testing. So this is about static unit testing. More issues caught earlier lead to fewer errors being identified in the dynamic test phase and results in the fewer defects in shipped products. So, moreover, performing static test is less expensive than performing dynamic tests. Code review is one component of the defect minimization process and can help detect problems that are common to software development. After a round of code review, dynamic unit testing is conducted. In dynamic unit testing, now, what does dynamic unit testing affect? So, in dynamic unit testing, a programmer unit is actually executed and its outcome are observed. Dynamic unit testing means testing the code by actually running it, and in static, without executing a code. It may be noted that static unit testing is not an alternative to dynamic unit testing. A programmer performs both kinds of tests. In practice, partial dynamic unit testing is performed concurrently with static unit testing. If the entire dynamic unit testing has been performed and a static unit testing identifies significant problems, the dynamic unit testing must be repeated. As a result of this repetition, the development schedule may be affected. To minimize the probability of such an event, it is required that static unit testing be performed prior to the final dynamic unit testing. So, in static unit testing, code is reviewed by applying techniques commonly known as inspection and walkthrough. Now, inspection, what does it mean? It is a step by step peer group review of work product with, with each step checked against predetermined criteria. Walkthrough. It is a review where the author leads the team through a manual or simulated execution of the product by using predefined scenario, regardless of whether a review is called an inspection or a walkthrough. So, in dynamic unit testing, it is a execution based unit testing referred to as the dynamic unit testing. In this testing, a program unit is actually executed in isolation as we commonly understand it. However, this execution differs from ordinary execution in the following way. Now, what is the way? So, first, a unit under test is taken out of its actual execution environment. The actual execution environment is emulated by writing more code, explained later in the section so that the unit and the emulated environment can be compiled together. Third one, the above compiled aggregate is executed with selected input. So now the we'll see the key difference between the static testing and the dynamic testing. So static testing involves the testing of the documented artifacts, and dynamic testing involves the execution of the test cases over software, product, or code. It analyzes Static testing analyzes and evaluates the software product in a non operational mode, whereas dynamic testing performs the testing in the runtime environment. It is the working of the static and the dynamic testing. Now, it is a static testing is performed at an early stage of the development life cycle, and dynamic testing is performed at a later stage of the development life cycle. Static testing verifies business requirement, functional requirement, etc. And dynamic testing validates pre-specified requirements at each level of software development. Static testing works as a preventive measure to avoid defects in the software, whereas the dynamic testing is responsible for the corrective actions like removing and fixing defects. Static testing requires less amount of time and cost, whereas the dynamic testing is time and cost is comparatively higher. Static testing requires manual approach, whereas the dynamic testing may require manual or automation approach. Static testing is a low level activity, whereas dynamic testing is a high level activity. So, Statement coverage is higher and almost near to 100% in static, whereas in dynamic, it does not guarantee the 100% statement coverage. So, this is the key difference between the static and the dynamic testing in unit testing. So, this is all about the static and dynamic testing. Thank you so much.